Hello YouTube, my name is Alex. Welcome back to the Lifting Nomad. Today's video, I want to talk about how much money you actually need to make in order to live the DN, remote work, future of work, digital bromad, fitness nomad lifestyle. So without further ado, let's get into the video. All right, so when it comes to understanding how much money you need to make in order to live the remote work lifestyle, it depends on a number of variables on the person. And I've broken this up into what I think to be the most accurate 4 categories for that. And basically it's accommodations, food, the travel between cities, so your travel lifestyle, as well as the actual finances you're gonna have back at home. So savings, investments, etc. So with each of those, let's talk about them individually. So the first one is going to be accommodations. Now this is typically your biggest expense month over month, and it can vary a lot. When I was in the Algarve, I stayed in Lagos this summer in Portugal. I was in a hostel called the Rising Cock Party Hostel. On the walls they had signs about 20 years of cock. There was beer pong, flip cup every single night, and a 7-day-a-week pub crawl. And it was pretty ratchet. It was a lot of fun, but holy, that was an experience. My first night in that hostel, I got there and it was 8 bunk beds in one room, which is actually pretty not that many for dorms. One of my friends stayed in Prague and was in a 64-bed dorm room for $1 a night. And at the Rising Cock, the first night I got there, it was like 40 degrees in Lagos, so like 105 Fahrenheit. Absolutely insanely hot. There was no aircon, no window, and no blinds, and only one fan for the whole room. And the first night I was there, 8 guys sleeping in those bunks. I'll let you take a guess how that room smelled. I'll give you a hint. It smelled like ass. And that's definitely on the more frugal side. When I was in Colombia, we met a few people who were just doing like English teaching, who were staying in hostels, backpack style, in dorm rooms for like $5 a night. And you can last a long time doing that, right? If you think $5 a night, 30 days in a month, that's like $150 a month for rent. And that's like the bottom of the barrel. The problem with that is typically you're sharing a communal kitchen. So sometimes people will eat your food. There's oftentimes just a long wait to use like the oven or the stove. It can also be incredibly difficult to eat healthy when you're like kind of navigating all these barriers, because you're gonna end up just eating out all the time because it's easier. And then you spend more money that way as well. So accommodations, first thing to consider, is going to be the biggest chunk out of your budget. You can go all the way from, like I said, $150 for like a budget backpacking hostel, all the way up to like $2,000-$3,000 a month for an Airbnb, or if you want to stay in a hotel, like $5,000 a month. So it really depends on how much, how cheaply you want to live for your accommodations. For me personally, being like a fitness bro type dude, I need a kitchen most of the time. So I try and pick like Airbnbs or a private room in a hostel, maybe like a bigger hostel. Salinas are really popular right now for co-working, where you can get a private room for like a month for like $2,000, which isn't too bad really if you think about the rent back home in Toronto. And then that gives you access to the kitchens. They tend to be pretty big in Salinas as well. So that's an option, something I would recommend for you to consider. But accommodation is definitely gonna be the first thing you have to think about when you're making that call. All right, now the second thing to consider is the food you're gonna be eating and how you're gonna be eating while you're away. So I kind of talked about that with the accommodations around the kitchen, but again, me being like a fitness bro, I try to eat as healthily as I can and as much as I can at home. That way I'm tracking my calories as close to as possible. Definitely when I'm traveling, I'm drinking a lot more than when I'm doing these travel breaks back at home where I am now, but still I'm being conscious of what kind of food I'm eating. So second biggest expense is gonna be your food, and this can vary quite a lot. When I was staying in Iceland, I was in a hostel, and Iceland's incredibly expensive compared to like most of Europe or South America, of course. But there was this Aussie in my bunks, and he was telling me basically he just always buys groceries and buys beers from the grocery stores instead of going to bars or restaurants, no matter where he is. So in Iceland especially, it was really expensive. Unfortunately, the groceries were crazy expensive too, so I don't know how much money he was actually saving. But food can vary quite a lot. If you're being really budget conscious and you're buying all your meals in a grocery store, you're even like couponing and saving money the way you would back at home, that can only range from like, let's say $5 to $10 a day if you're smart about your money. So then you're like $300, $400, $500 a month for food, which is, you combine that with staying in a hostel on cheap ass accommodations, you could be like under $1,000 a month to live and eat in a different country if you're being like as frugal as possible. So the idea with this video, like I said, is to kind of think about this in a bigger lens, how much money you actually need to make in order to sustain this lifestyle. So truly just to live and eat and exist as cheaply as possible, you're looking at like $1,000 a month, kind of bare minimum. That's assuming you're not really traveling luxuriously as well, but we'll talk about that in the third part here. But with food as well, you know, typically you're eating out 1 to 2 meals a day on average. I would say, especially in South America, it's so cheap, it's almost more affordable. Like you can get street tacos for like $1 or $2. So it's almost more, you know, cost effective to just go buy the food than to cook it back at home for time for money kind of thing, right? So that's your food budget. I would say $5 to $10 a day if you're eating really, really cheaply. Typically I budget anywhere from like $30 to $50, just because I'm, you know, in a different place in my life where I can enjoy a little bit more of the luxuries. But food is typically going to be your second biggest expense. So on my average, I would say like $1,500 a month for rent is what I look for. $1,500 to $2,000 in Canadian dollars. Unfortunately, it's pretty criminal compared to the USD right now. The loonie, as we call it up here. And then the second biggest expense is going to be your food budget, which I would say I ballpark around $1,000 a month for me. And again, don't use myself as a barometer for everything. I live, when I travel, I'm definitely living a little bit more luxurious than most people, but I have a pretty good job that gives me a lot of freedom to do so. So second biggest part, your food, definitely something to consider. Third biggest cost, and the thing to think about when you're trying to consider how much money you need to make, is the travel between cities. So there's a lot of different ways, especially in Europe primarily. South America is a little less, but Europe, you can really get around extremely cheaply on buses and trains. Trains are a little bit more expensive, but even flights on things like Ryanair, which are, it is a budget airline. Typically you have to like pedal a bike on the runway to get off, and you may lose your luggage, but it's definitely more affordable than North America by far. Like you can get flights for like $10, $15, $20 sometimes, which is amazing between cities, even though it's like almost always delayed and there's just like a shit show of an airline, but you get there, right? One of my friends did like an overnight 3-night bus from like Czech Republic. I forget where they were going, but it was like $2 to $3 for this 3-day bus ride to get across country. So you can do it a lot more affordably. At this point in my life, I'm not doing those kind of buses anymore. After I stayed in that Rising Cock hostel, it was really like indicative of myself being past that phase where I can handle paying that little bit of money and saving that much to live like in a really shitty accommodation. Same thing with my travel. I don't travel in first class by far. I don't think it's worth it for anything less than like 10 hours because you're just gonna like, you know, have a couple beers in the airport bar, maybe take a sleeping pill, and then your lights out for most of it anyways, in my experience, as long as you're doing overnight flights. So for me, the travel between cities, I try and find budget flights, which can be like once you're down in South America, like for instance, I'm flying from Miami to Buenos Aires. That flight was $400 one way, which is like quite a lot. But when I'm down there to go to Santiago, Chile is like $60 round trip from Buenos Aires. So accounting for that and how long you're gonna be in each city is really where you need to plan ahead. Put some Google flight trackers in your email as well, so you're actually monitoring the cost over time to try and get the best deal. So number 3, I would say your flights and travel between cities is definitely one of the biggest expenses to consider and something you need to keep in mind. All right, fourth thing to consider when you're trying to calculate how much money you need to make in order to sustain yourself while living is your finances and savings. Now, there's a difference between existing and living, right? Where you're living in these shitty accommodations, eating like bananas and bread and sandwiches all the time, and then just getting by, but you're not actually saving any money, or potentially you're even dipping into your savings back home. So when I travel, I try to make money, like quite a lot of it. And reason being, my expenses tend to be a lot lower. Like when I'm in Toronto, I'm spending like $2,500 a month on rent. I'm eating out all the time, I'm drinking out all the time, and it's like ridiculously expensive. A beer is like minimum $10 now versus like even in Portugal, a pint's like €1. Right? So you can save a ton of money by being smart about it and budgeting when you're down there. I am excited to try out Buenos Aires again with cash because, like I talked about in other videos, their blue dollar rate, so essentially their unofficial conversion of USD to Argentinian pesos, there's like a black market rate you can get, which is more than double the official rate you'll get from a bank. So I'm actually going to be bringing cash, not using my credit card when I'm down there. And then I have that set amount of cash for the time I'm there. So it's going to be interesting to try and budget that out and see how it pans out for myself. But that's definitely something you need to consider. I try and save like upwards of like 25 to 40% of my monthly income from when I'm traveling and working because of how cheaply I can live while I'm down there. So it's a couple of things to keep in mind, but I think those are the 4 most important things to consider: accommodations, food, travel between cities, and then your savings finances back home. Now, with all that being said, to give a number, I would say, in my experience, like I said, most people need to make a minimum of like 25 to 30,000 in order to A, live, B, travel, and C, like have any sort of financial sustainability from the long term of doing it. Depending on the style you're going to travel in, it can go upwards of like 50, 60, 75. The problem I come across is that once you start to get over like 100, 150,000, you tend, unless you're running your own business, you tend to be working a lot. So it's kind of hard to travel and work when you're working so many hours. But that's really just the balancing act. You have to decide what's important to you. Do you want to see the world and travel, or do you want to work a really 9-to-5 corporate job? And unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that. That's really only something that you can figure out for your own. But I hope this gave you some ideas of how much it actually costs to be a digital nomad. It's things to consider. I know a lot of people are on the fence, and right now, over the next 3 to 5 years, it's estimated that like 1 billion people or 2 billion people are going to be working remote. So there's a lot of folks out there who are going to be thinking through this math. So I hope this was useful for some of you. If it was, feel free to leave a comment agreeing or disagreeing. Tell me to touch grass, whatever it is, in the section below. But otherwise, give me a thumbs up or subscribe if this was useful. Always helps the algorithm. My name is Alex. Welcome to the Lifting Nomad, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.